The Sleepers, Chapter 45, Nightmares. No matter how many physical or metaphorical locked doors I opened, Jane was never satisfied. I'd get a week or a month break, and then she'd start pressing for more, breaking me down with charm and persuasion. Jane wanted to know my history with Ray, again pushing with flirtation to coax out the truth. Some part of her needed to understand my feelings toward him. It was not enough to be a sleeper-client pair. She needed to understand the suffering behind my actions. She needed to humanize me, even if she praised the monster. She required an explanation of the past, and I finally complied. Fine, I relented after days of pressing. Let's sit on the balcony. A story like this can't be told as we cuddle in bed. It seemed staring outdoors at the night sky was the most fitting place to ponder my life with Ray. My animosity toward Ray and the Matson clan began shortly after becoming a sleeper. Resentment was inevitable, I told her. I lost my freedom and friendship and soon abandoned my naive goodwill. Being a quick child, I decided at the age of 10 to transmit torment through repeated nightmares. Jane clapped with enthusiasm.
Oh, I have wanted to hear this story since you first mentioned it. I can't believe you purposefully transmitted nightmares to Ray. I thought our manipulation was bad.
This woman was dangerous. Let me explain. Night terrors diminish gradually as a child matures. Learned fears, anxieties, and fantasies replace freakish chimeras. And then as we enter adolescence, sexual exploration supplants monsters. At this, Jane interrupted with a teasing jab at the ribs.
Am I going to learn about your fantasies, or about the root of your issues with Ray? We've left the bedroom.
It's coming. Be patient, I smirked. Anyway, our dreams mature. You no longer face childhood deaths, but are probably still plagued with exams for which you did not prepare. This is a common evolution across our culture. But this natural change doesn't occur before many clients are blessed with their first sleeper. Still young enough to experience repeat nightmares, so-called bad dreams condition the client child to anticipate borrowed sleep like a great birthday present. The new client believes all those worries will vanish, having learned that dream transfer is infrequent and murky. Rarely do parents speak the truth. Nightmares more readily cross the brain barrier and are the most likely client-child dream. Still staring across the city and up to the stars, Jane reached over to hold my hand, as if we were about to watch the best scary movie. She transmitted electrified enthusiasm. I looked over, admiring her brown locks curled for another late night with Ray. I'd have to imagine that was for me. Ray's parents, like so many other clients, held back the full truth. But I knew better. I listened to my father enough to know, as he put it, that, quote, nightmares are the most likely non-lucid dream to transmit between sleeper and client. The intensity, both emotionally and visually, scars both connected minds. My father never missed a chance to educate me on sleep science, knowing I would fulfill his same corporate responsibilities. Within the same scientific explanations, he invariably entangled his conflicting philosophy. I changed my voice to mock his seriousness, quoting, However, John, someday in each client's life, he or she will realize, subconsciously or not, how much they miss unfiltered, self-inspired dream time, even that of nightmares. Ray may be happy now to have only a few intense dreams from you, and the hazy shadows his mind conjures, but that will change. Sadly, by the time he misses pre-sleep, the addiction will be complete. The time for change past, and he, like so many others, will be trapped as a lifelong client. Only poverty, death, or age will break the connection. My father then paused, assessing my confused expression before finishing. You may think your lot is hard, but there is misery on both sides. Rotating her chair to look at me and shrink all distance, Jane reached over to caress my cheek. I love you, she whispered. I smiled back, starstruck at those eyes that captured me so long ago at the gala. The world, as her backdrop, melted away. I was, of course, too young to respond or internalize my father's depth, let alone intelligently disagree. But I could and would act on the science. In transmitting nightmares, I ran the risk of severing our link. Too many disturbing downloads, and Ray's father could pull the plug. The Matson dynasty was not required to employ us forever. Contrary to my latter plans, at this age I still believed I wanted to lose my job. The possibility was worth every horrible dream. Long-term strategizing was not yet my specialty. So, I invoked nightmarish sleep sessions by watching the scariest movies possible before rest and upload. Jane could no longer remain silent. She pulled her hands to her hips to express her mock outrage.
You refuse to ever watch scary movies with me.
Well, it was no picnic, I laughed. But both of us paid dearly. Troubled hours for me meant troubled downloads for Ray. Although what Ray experienced was not a perfect match to my nightmares, the graphic content inspired frightening images during transfer. Ray appeared noticeably shaken on subsequent school days, disturbed by unknown horrors. But the side effects for me were too personally grueling. Expecting a nightmare does not alleviate its misery. After a 5-day trial, I quit this devilish campaign, and have avoided those movies ever since. Jane squished her face and smirked, satisfied with my nightmare anecdote. I held back, explaining, though, that the experiment was not an utter bust. I discovered action-reaction. I learned that my actions and thoughts influenced Ray's life. I realized I had power to shape our experience and be a catalyst for change. I was the one in charge. Quitting that campaign, I chose to play along until the right venomous moment.
Having heard John's childhood woes and now this tale of nightmares, Jane had to get some perspective. Carl was long dead, and she didn't think she would have liked talking to him anyway. John's father was a closed book unless he chose to open up. That left Ray. Interrogating her second boyfriend was much easier than her first. A few right questions and a look of admiration, and Ray wouldn't shut up. His walls were paper thin. Dating and interviewing Ray shed light on John's struggle. Ray was annoyingly lovable, but not worth hating and definitely not sinister. Yet he provided a conflict to all of John's behaviors, a rival where none was needed. John could love and hate him because he was like a brother, and there's no one you can have mixed feelings for better than family. Ray, on the other hand, lived in ignorance, choosing to accept John as sleeper and friend and avoid asking too many questions. In fact, she was pretty sure he had no clue what John was thinking. She started with his childhood, eager to tease out any hint that he knew about the nightmares. This would be crucial information for John and his father to protect them when John sent the real lucid dream. It was 10 p.m., time for one of their extravagant dinners, an anniversary of sorts. She'd convinced Ray months ago that she needed each evening to grade papers and could only handle late outings. As a client, his mealtime rituals were completely absurd. 10 p.m. sounded perfect, and he never questioned her workload or priorities. Truth was, she did grade papers, but then spent the early evening with John. It was a good thing those two had run out of time together for John's cooking, often skipping the meal altogether. Her body could not afford 2 meals before bed each night. She wore a new dark velvet red dress, cut in the latest style with angles across each shoulder. She'd never have afforded it on her own budget, and never would have accepted John or Ray's charity, but John Jr. had given her funds for outfits. It was about the only thing besides grief she got from the puppet master. The restaurant tonight was meant to be elitist and quiet. Half the tables filled the open court, encircled by private booths around the edge. Brilliant white cloths and way too much silverware adorned each table. The wine rack against the wood-paneled back wall said they'd be taking your money tonight, and clearly the whole staff aimed to please Ray, or at least his family. Jane could hardly imagine the need for a refill or a crumb cleaning before some attendant swooped in to save the day. She found herself adjusting her shoulder straps nervously, as if she didn't belong. This was the fanciest date she'd ever had. "I've watched students become sleepers," she casually told Ray as they sipped their first glasses, proudly selected by Ray, "but never seen them become clients. I imagine it would be the opposite of what my kids go through. Everything exciting and new." Ray, with that messy sandy hair, nodded and shook his head simultaneously, indicating his mixed feelings and opening the door to the real question. "Well, then what was it like for you?" He reached over and held both of her hands, letting out a nostalgic sigh. Rarely did Jane need to initiate affection. I wish I could say it was all completely wonderful. Oh, it was fantastic, staying up late the first time, don't get me wrong. My parents gave me a lot of freedom, knowing that I would find countless good ways to spend my time, and I loved every waking minute. But all good things have a price. John was right. One just had to nod occasionally, and Ray would not stop. So she gave the obligatory nod, a heartfelt smile, and learned everything. My parents had told me all the good in sleep growing up. For goodness sakes, our family crest might as well have been a sleeper and a client. I was inundated with family praise for my grandfather, Desmond. I learned over and over how we saved the world, though I never understood from what, and how we had made life better for everyone. So of course I was excited for my first sleep. It was going to be magical. I was only 8 and had no idea what this would all mean from my friend and sleeper. You've really got to meet him sometime. Anyway, I didn't realize that our friendship would end for a while. You wouldn't know it now, but we were true best friends. We had family dinners together, played together at recess, did everything together. And then it all stopped. He became my sleeper, and that relationship defined us. He needed no more encouragement, but I knew John and couldn't help but say, "I'm so sorry, Ray." We talked some still after sleep started, and family dinners and class time were unavoidable. But I lost my best friend. Oh, he would try, but it wasn't the same. I went to my mom for some comfort, but that was a tough lesson in love. I told my mom that John hated me, that he never wanted to play with me anymore, and I couldn't stop crying. I wanted things back to normal. She'd say things like, "I'm sorry, but this is what it means to be a Madsen. Sadly, you are learning it very young." Or, "Wealth and power do not create real friends. You are born to the greatest family line in the world with the greatest opportunity awaiting you. Such a world is not free and not often with friends. In fact, it can be the loneliest of all worlds." "But I don't want that world. I want my friend again. It all started with that stupid sleeping," I told her back. He said, mimicking a child's voice. My mom loved me as her one and only child and the heir to Sleep Free, but she was invested just like my father. Sometimes it seemed more so. You know that she's the one that ensured John and I were born about the same age and would continue the tradition. It was happenstance for our fathers, but when John's mom, Susan, got pregnant, my mom wasted no time. Kind of weird to talk about, I know. Anyway, she was going to keep the pattern alive. I think Susan sprung the news on her, hoping to break the cycle, but my mom caught up. She learned Susan was having a boy and ordered one too, making sure 2 boys would inherit the family wealth and arrangement. Jane mouthed surprise to Ray, but let him continue. There seemed to be no limit to the depth of deceit in John's relationships. When the waiter approached with dinner menus, she waved him away without Ray noticing. No interruption. Anyway, my mom wanted to console me, but she also wasn't going to free me. She explained that John didn't hate me, but that he was learning to be a sleeper just like I needed to learn to be a client. She then said, "It would get easier. I promise you'll be friends again. Trust me. Just look at your fathers." And she was right. My dad and John Jr. made it work, and so would we. It took years, and we are not perfect friends, but we have stuck with each other to this day. Jane couldn't bear to point out that his friendship was a fake, at least on most levels. So she responded with trite replies, trying to bury any potential sarcasm. "I never thought about what it would be like for friends. Most of my sleepers don't know their clients when it starts. Depending on the arrangements, some never meet their clients. That must be a better way, a cleaner way." Jane wanted to clarify that there was no good way. The whole system was rotten. But this was about Ray. For some reason, her response triggered something from his memory banks, and Jane finally learned what she wanted to know. "You are absolutely right, Jane. I have debated that point many times in my mind. Sharing sleep is an intimate exchange that includes more than I understood. For instance, no one told me about the nightmares. I had thought nightmares went away, and they can to some extent, but not intense sleeper dreams, especially children's nightmares. Of course, I didn't understand any of this as a kid, but I quickly learned that John must have been a troubled sleeper because I got all of his nightmares. That's not something children should share. He's not a lucid dreamer, never even ranks on the lucidity matrix, but he had a lot of bad dreams. There was 1 week of non-stop frights, but most of the time it was just fear, like what you feel when you are worried about failure. I could feel more than see what he saw in those nightmares. My own dreams latching on to intense images and emotions from his dream seeds. I never asked about it, knowing even as a child that it was too personal, but it gave me compassion. She tenderly spoke a quiet, "I love you." It was all she could think as she heard Ray's perspective, though it was time to guide the conversation. She did love both men. She couldn't help it. Ray was a good man. Wealth had not gone to his head. He hadn't tormented his sleeper or taken advantage of his position. In fact, it had softened his heart. Much of his kindness grew in response to watching John. She could love Ray because they both loved John, or because together these two men were, well, perfect. What a strange triangle. The wine flowed freely, just like Ray's tongue. He ordered an array of courses to match the discussion, giving her ample time to work in John's secret assignment for the night. Amazing bruschetta and quiche came first. The salmon she'd selected was probably on a helicopter ride inland at the moment. After the waiters cleared the appetizers, Jane could see a new patron over Ray's shoulder, demanding to be seated in just the right spot. The young woman rocked a short blue dress and a doting man at her side, uncomfortably aware he was not in charge. What an interesting couple. She was one of those girls Jane would have hated in school, a princess that would have mocked Jane for not being the right size, right color, or right caste. That girl definitely could afford a sleeper and likely a much better education than Jane's. The couple approached her table, following the waiter to a private booth. Jane and Ray sat center stage the way Ray liked it. But this couple expected seclusion. As the two came closer, the woman's face crystallized. Jane dropped the fork, precipitating a shrill zing from silver on china. Ray hardly noticed, having moved on to another subject, yet still talking. Jane knew this blue-dressed blonde beauty. Well, knew was a bit of a stretch. She'd seen this woman before, in John's race dream. How could you forget such a racer? Or John's calculated emotion? John was truly the master of dreams. "Ray?" asked the pretentious woman, pausing to interrupt her dinner after a sideways glance at him. She ignored Jane entirely, a true professional snot. Jane stared in disgust. Who was she? Ray flushed with mortification, speechless. She'd never seen Ray completely dumbfounded. He fumbled, "Hello, Samantha." Samantha? A name for a tramp for sure. Samantha flashed a dangerous smile for Ray, ignoring her own date as much as Jane. "So great to see you!" She touched his shoulder, exerting her control. Of all the nerve. Jane caught how Samantha casually rotated a ring on her finger, hiding the giant rock from Ray. No one could miss that ring, but Ray was too lost in her eyes, that blonde hair, or that mesmerizing dress. She was most certainly not on a teacher's salary. After meaningless small talk, Samantha allowed Ray to introduce Jane. Samantha wanted to know who Jane was, if she was important enough to care, before introducing her own partner, just in case Jane mattered. Her date and apparent fiancé was Amazon royalty, clearly a fine catch for this hunter. Unable to muster pleasantries like "nice to meet you," Jane ended the dinner interruption abruptly. "Well, enjoy your dinner. Don't let us keep you waiting from being seated." It was rudely delivered and more rudely intended, but Samantha got the point. She turned her nose up in the air and led Mr. Amazon, following the very patient waiter, to their table. Jane needed air, a chance to clear her head from this Samantha encounter. Even dating two men, she still felt there was no place for a second woman. "Excuse me, Ray, I'm going to slip to the restroom before the next course comes." Oh, of course," he muttered, still entranced by his ghost from the past. That dream must have worked really well for Jane to compete against Samantha and her kind. Gripping the bathroom counter, Jane counted slowly, taking deep breaths in silence. 4 minutes passed. An eternity. She had to get back to Ray. The cold ceramic jolted just enough to keep her alert. Everything else swam. All those feelings that she was in way over her head came crashing down. She was dating 2 very powerful men, the likes of whom associated with Samantha. Runner-up to Ray was an Amazon heir. How did all this happen? Jane steadied herself. It was time to get back before a helicopter of salmon really did arrive. She took one last look in the mirror and saw Samantha at the bathroom door. Jane quickly glanced away, hoping to have avoided eye contact in the reflection, then turned to make her exit as if she could avoid this fury. Samantha was on her, moving like a praying cat to Jane's side for interception. Jane, the trapped mouse, froze. She held Jane's hand, not forcefully, though she was clearly in control. With her other hand, she brushed away her long hair and locked eyes with Jane, forcing attention. Jane should have shaken off that cold hand, but curiosity got the best of her. "Are you dating John as well?" asked Samantha, skipping any introduction or excuse for grabbing a stranger's hand in the bathroom. Jane gawked. "What?" "Oh, you don't have to lie in this court. I'm not one to judge." Jane had no clue how to respond. What did Samantha mean? "The sleeper," she clarified, still suspicious but willing to play Jane's game. "Are you with him, too?" Now Jane was speechless. This seemed to be one of Samantha's skills. Jane needed to reply or at least attempt to lie, but the blue-dressed devil interrogated her with those piercing eyes. Samantha answered for Jane, nodding ever so slightly, but not releasing hands. "I understand. Separate. Those men are hopeless. They look good on paper, but something is missing. Together?" Samantha paused, her face filled with angelic lust. "Well, let's just say they're fantastic." She judged Jane's look of shock as embarrassment and explained further. "You don't have to be ashamed. There's nothing incestuous or unnatural about it. They're practically the same creature, all wrapped up in some tragic mix of souls. I was too young back then to handle them both. But you might do just fine. You've got the eyes for it. Good luck to you." Samantha then flipped her head up in pride, unlocking their eyes, and released Jane's hand, allowing her freedom. Jane had no response besides a quiet, "Okay." So that was the other girl John had mentioned. It was all too much. If that was the only outrageous revelation of the night, Jane might have laughed it off. But there was still salmon and then dessert, and Ray, the great open book, felt like talking after his encounter with Samantha.